when a newborn baby was in critical condition and showing signs of dying. Miranda, a nurse, who made a bold decision putting her next to her twin sister in the incubator, despite the fact that it was against standard medical protocol and could have been dangerous. What followed was something no one could have foreseen, a miracle. The hospital's hallways echoed with the steady rhythm of beeping machines and the hushed murmurs of nurses exchanging updates. Miranda moved through it all like a ghost, her white coat swaying behind her as she hurried from one patient to the next. To anyone watching, she was the picture of professionalism, efficient, composed, and relentless in her care, but inside she was hollow like an empty room, echoing with memories of what could have been. 2 years have passed. Miranda still clearly remembers that day. She was so happy when she found out she was pregnant, but then a stomach ache made her faint, and when she woke up, her entire future as a mother had been severed alongside her reproductive organs. She could still recall the clinical coldness of the doctor's voice explaining the complications as if it were no different than reading a chart. They had done everything they could, a routine procedure, to fix an ectopic pregnancy, but the damage was irreversible. The pregnancy had ruptured her fallopian tube, and in the process they had been forced to remove both ovaries. She was alive, but the cost of that life was unbearable. Paul had been there, his hand gripping hers tightly in the recovery room. His silence said more than words ever could. For the first few months he was her rock, patient, supportive, and full of promises that they could explore other ways to have a family. Adoption, surrogacy, he said. "Wick, find a way." He reassured her again and again, but over time the promises lost their strength, and his words came less frequently. Now they lived in a quiet house full of unsaid things Miranda hadn't told Paul. The whole truth. She hadn't told him how she had cried in the shower every morning before work, or how the sight of a pregnant woman in the grocery store could send her into a spiral of grief so deep that she had to excuse herself to the restroom just to pull it together. It was easier this way, she told herself. Paul had his own pain to carry, and he didn't need to bear hers too. And so she worked at the hospital. She could pretend she was in control, that she had a purpose beyond the gaping hole that loss had carved inside her. She took every shift she could, often staying well past the end of her scheduled hours. Her colleagues assumed it was her drive, her ambition. None of them knew the truth, that every hour spent at work was an hour she didn't have to go home to. Silence to Paul's growing distance. Paul had tried. God, he had tried. He was still trying. But even now, as she trudged through yet another grueling day at the hospital, Miranda knew it was slipping away. Their marriage, their connection, the love that once felt so easy, so inevitable, now hung between them like a fragile thread. She caught glimpses of it, sometimes in the way Paul looked at her, when he thought she wasn't watching, a mix of sadness, frustration, and something else, resignation. Perhaps she never asked him how he felt. How could she, when she barely knew how she felt? They were two strangers, sharing the same house, navigating through a fog of grief they didn't know how to talk about. On this particular day, she found herself assigned to the pediatric ward, caring for children with illnesses she once would have thought unbearable to witness. Now it was simply another shield, another wall she could erect between herself and the raw emptiness gnawing at her. The children were innocent, helpless, in ways that both broke and fortified her. They needed her, and in their need, she found temporary relief. But it was never enough. Miranda's fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted the IV on a little boy's arm. His mother sat in the corner of the room, eyes red from lack of sleep, watching Miranda with a mixture of hope and exhaustion. The boy was no older than 5, his face pale but calm in sleep. He had leukemia, diagnosed a few months ago. His prognosis was uncertain, but his mother clung to every ounce of hope, like it was the only thing keeping her from crumbling. Miranda finished adjusting the IV and glanced at the woman. "He's stable for now," she said, her voice more gentle than she had intended. "You should try to get some rest." The woman gave a weak nod, but didn't move from her chair. Miranda understood she wouldn't leave either. Walking out of the room, Miranda's throat tightened. She had mastered the art of suppressing emotion over the past 2 years, but days like this, when she saw the fierce love in her mother's eyes, made it impossible to ignore. What she had lost, the hospital, might have been her sanctuary, but it was also a daily reminder of the life she could never have. And as she moved down the hall past the murmur and the machines, she couldn't shake the thought that maybe this was all she had left. Miranda glanced at the clock mounted on the hospital wall. It was well past midnight, her shift already extended by several hours. Her eyes stung from fatigue, but she pushed through, as she always did. The halls of the neonatal intensive care unit buzzed faintly with the sounds of machines and the muted conversations of the night crew. She had spent years in this world of constant vigilance, tending to infants who teetered on the edge of life, but nothing ever prepared her for the next emergency. A voice crackled over the intercom, shattering the quiet. "Miranda, we need you in ER immediate." It was Dr. Lawson, his voice tight with urgency. Without a second thought, Miranda gathered her things, her body reacting on instinct. Emergencies in her line of work were never easy, but they were part of the job, a part she'd grown used to. As she approached the emergency room, a scene of controlled chaos unfolded. A woman had been wheeled in on a gurney, pale and sweating. Her clothes were threadbare and her hair clung to her forehead in damp clumps. Homeless, someone whispered. Twin pregnancy, 6 months. Miranda's stomach twisted. The woman's condition was dire. Her vitals dangerously low. It didn't take long to assess that the babies inside her were at risk. A team of nurses and doctors converged, preparing for the emergency cesarean. Miranda stepped into the room just as the doors swung shut behind her. Cold light overhead illuminating the tense faces around her. As the surgical team worked, Miranda kept her focus on the 2 incubators they had prepared for the twins. The tiny life inside the mother needed to be saved, and Miranda felt a pulse of fierce determination wash over her. There was no room for hesitation here. The stakes were life and death. The cesarean lasted longer than expected, and when the babies were finally delivered, the silence was deafening. Miranda's heart clenched. No cries, no movement. She rushed to the first infant, a girl, and placed her in the incubator. The child's skin was a dusky purple, her chest barely rising. The second girl, even smaller, was brought in next, her condition far worse. Aura, they would name her, later, was limp, her tiny body almost lifeless. Both babies were in critical condition. Miranda watched as Dr. Lawson tried to stabilize the mother. Minutes later, the woman's vitals flatlined. She was gone before Miranda even had a chance to learn her name. Hours passed, a haze of procedures and exhaustion as Miranda and the team fought to keep the twins alive. When the chaos finally settled, a nurse approached her with a file. The ID the woman gave us, it's fake, no records, no matches. Miranda stared at the chart in disbelief. The mother had vanished from their lives just as quickly as she had entered. She looked over at the 2 incubators, at the fragile lives left behind. These girls had no one. Miranda felt a sudden fierce sense of protectiveness. The larger twin, Emma, had responded slightly to the oxygen and care, her vitals stabilizing, but Aura was different. She was slipping away, her heart rate too weak, her breathing erratic. Despite every intervention, Aura remained unresponsive, her body still and vulnerable under the cold glare of medical lights. Miranda refused to give up. There was something about these twins, something about their arrival in such a desperate state, that tugged at her. She watched Aura's tiny chest struggle to rise and fall, and a pang of something raw and deep hit her. It was too familiar, too close to the wound she thought had healed in the early hours of the morning. When the bustle of the hospital dimmed to a low hum, Miranda sat by the incubator. She rested her head against the glass, her breath fogging it slightly. Emma's small hand twitched, and for a moment her sister responded, just a flicker, a tiny shift of life. Miranda's heart skipped. Could they sense each other even now? Was there a connection between them that could pull Aura back from the brink? Night after night, Miranda stayed by their side, exhausted but resolute. Her colleagues cautioned her to not get too attached, but the bond had already formed. She felt it in the way her heart tightened every time she looked at the girls, and the way she couldn't bear to leave them. Even after her shift ended, Miranda watched the rise and fall of their chests, and in those quiet moments, memories of her past flooded back. The miscarriage, the emptiness that had followed. She had locked it away, buried it deep under the weight of her work. But now, looking at Emma and Aura, the ache resurfaced. Her hands trembled as she gently touched the side of the incubator. These babies needed her in ways no other patient ever had, and she needed them too. Miranda stood by the incubator, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, but still wide open, scanning every line on the monitor. 2 days had passed since Aura was brought into this world, 2 long, grueling days where hope seemed to stretch thinner with each hour. Despite all the interventions, all the oxygen and medicine, Aura's tiny chest struggled to rise. Her heart rate was sluggish, her frail body growing weaker by the minute. Miranda, Dr. Lawson's voice was low but serious as he approached her. We've done everything we can, she nodded without meeting his eyes, her gaze fixed on Aura's pale, still face. There was no need for him to say more. Miranda had been here before, watching helplessly as a fragile life slipped through her fingers, but this time it felt different, more personal. Losing Aura wasn't just losing a patient, it was like reliving the agony of her own loss, the miscarriage that had shattered her dreams of becoming a mother. Tears welled up behind her tired eyes, but she blinked them away, biting down hard on her lip. She couldn't let it happen again. Not this time, not Aura. A surge of desperation pulsed through her. She needed to do anything. Her mind raced, sifting through every piece of information she had ever come across, every
training session, every article. Then, like a beam of light in the darkness, she remembered something she had read years ago, a study about twins. Twins, they said, had a bond like no other when placed together. Their bodies responded in ways no one fully understood. Somehow they thrived off each other's presence. Miranda turned toward Laura's incubator, her mind spinning. Could it work? Could that connection, the very one that had kept these girls alive in the womb, save Aura? Now it wasn't protocol, it wasn't even close, but at this point, what did she have to lose? Without hesitating, she sought out Dr. Lawson. I want to put Aura in with Laura, she said firmly, her voice tinged with determination. He blinked at her, clearly taken aback. That's not standard procedure. We don't mix infants, especially when they're in critical condition like this. I know it's not. Miranda shot back her eyes sharp with resolve. But I've read about twin bonding. When? They're close, they can regulate each other's breathing, heart rate. Sometimes it's the only thing that works. Please, this is her last chance. Lawson hesitated, and Miranda could see the doubt playing out across his face. He wasn't the type to bend the rules easily, especially when lives were at stake, but she also knew he trusted her judgment, and right now she was banking on that. Miranda, he began, his tone heavy with caution. If this backfires, it could make things worse. I understand the risk, but if we do nothing, we'll lose her anyway. A long silence stretched between them, punctuated only by faint beeping of the machines. Then, with a reluctant sigh, he nodded. Do it. Miranda wasted no time. Carefully, with the help of a nurse, she lifted Aura, her body still so limp, so fragile, and gently placed her beside. Her sister Laura shifted slightly as if sensing her twin, and for a moment the two of them lay together in perfect stillness. The room held its breath, and then slowly, impossibly, Aura's heart rate began to rise. The once faint beeps of her monitor quickened, coming into rhythm with Laura's steady pulse. Miranda's breath caught in her throat. It was working. Dr. Lawson stepped closer, his disbelief palpable. I don't believe it, he murmured under his breath.